A hand cracked across a woman's face. The sound cut through the whole room. She spun sideways, caught the edge of a wooden table, and went down hard on one knee. One arm flew up to shield her head. The other wrapped tight around her swollen belly. Boots scraped. Chairs creaked. But nobody stood up. 40 men in that saloon, and not one of them moved. They looked at their drinks. They looked at the floor. They looked anywhere but at her. The drunk towered over her, swaying, grinning. He raised his big hand again. Her name was Clara Bennett. Widow. 8 months gone with child. And she had no one left in the world to stand between her and the fist coming down. Then a chair scraped back in the far corner. Slow. Deliberate. What happened next left that entire saloon frozen in silence. Stay with me on this. Let me back up. Because to understand why nobody in that room lifted a finger, you have to understand the town. Dry Creek wasn't much. A single dirt road. A church with a crooked steeple. A general store, a livery, and the saloon where most of the trouble lived. The kind of place the railroad forgot and the law never bothered to find. Out here, a man's word was law, and the man whose word mattered most was named Silas Crane. Crane owned the cattle. Crane owned the water rights. Crane owned the bank that held half the mortgages in the county, and the men who couldn't pay drank in his saloon and pretended they still had something left to lose. When Crane wanted a thing, he got it. And lately, Crane wanted the Bennett land. It was good land. 40 acres along the creek, the only stretch for miles with water that didn't dry up come August. Clara's husband had broken his back clearing it. Thomas Bennett, a quiet, stubborn homesteader who believed if you worked hard enough and stayed honest enough, the world would leave you be. The world did not leave him be. A winter fever took him in 3 days. 1 week he was mending the fence line, and the next Clara was standing over a hole in the frozen ground. 8 weeks along with the child Thomas would never see. That was 6 months ago. Now here's the thing about being a widow in a town like Dry Creek. You don't get to grieve. You get to survive. The mortgage didn't stop. The store still wanted paying. And a woman alone, heavy with child, doesn't have many doors open to her. So Clara took the only work she could find. She cleaned the saloon. She carried plates. She hauled water and scrubbed floors on her knees until they ached. And she swallowed every filthy word the drinkers threw at her. Because the alternative was the road. And the road in winter, in her condition, was a death sentence. Some nights, she'd lock the door of her little rented room, sit on the edge of the bed with both hands on her belly, and talk to the child. Tell it about its father. Tell it about the land, the creek in spring, the cottonwood Thomas had planted the day they married. Promise it, in a whisper, that no matter what, she would find a way. She didn't always believe it, but she said it anyway, every night, because the child needed somebody to believe it, and there was nobody left but her. Crane knew all of this. That was the point. He'd offered to buy her out 3 times. Pennies on the dollar. And 3 times she'd said no. Because that land was the last thing Thomas left her. That land was where she meant to raise their child. Say no to a man like Crane often enough, and eventually he stops asking. And Clara knew exactly what happened to people who said no to Silas Crane. Everybody in Dry Creek did. 3 years back, a rancher named Caleb Ford had stood up at a town meeting and called Crane a thief to his face. Said the water rights were stolen. Said somebody ought to ride to the territorial capital and bring the marshals. Folks had nodded along. For about a week. Then Caleb Ford's barn burned. Then his cattle started turning up dead in the creek. Then the bank called his note. All at once, no warning. And by the end of that summer, Caleb Ford and his family were gone, run clean out of the county with nothing but a wagon and the clothes on their backs. Nobody ever proved Crane did a thing. Nobody had to. The lesson got learned just fine. So when the big man came through the door that night, every man in the saloon already knew the rules. His name was Bull Hagen, Crane's man, the kind of brute Crane kept around for exactly this sort of work. He was drunk before he arrived, and he got drunker fast, and every time Clara passed his table, he said something that made the other men laugh and look away at the same time. She kept her head down. She'd learned that much. Don't answer. Don't meet their eyes. Just get through the night. But Bull Hagen wasn't there to drink. He was there with a message, and the message had a hand attached to it. There was one other man in the room who didn't laugh. He sat alone in the far corner, back to the wall, the way men sit when they've learned the hard way what happens when you don't. He'd been in Dry Creek maybe 4 days. Rode in on a gray horse, paid for a room, said almost nothing. He drank coffee, never whiskey. He watched the door, and he kept to himself so completely that most folks had already stopped noticing he was there. Nobody knew his name yet. Nobody had asked. In a town like Dry Creek, you learn not to ask. But Clara had noticed one thing about him. 2 nights back, she'd dropped a tray, sent glasses shattering across the floor, and braced herself for the laughter, the curses, the usual. And the stranger in the corner had been the only one to crouch down and help her gather the pieces. He hadn't said a word. He'd just handed her the broken glass, looked at her for half a second, and gone back to his coffee. She hadn't thought much of it. A small kindness in a town with none to spare. She had no idea that small kindness was about to change everything. Because Bull Hagen had just stood up, and he was walking straight toward her. "Crane wants your answer," Bull said. Clara kept stacking the empty glasses. Her hands were steady. She'd promised herself they would be. "He has my answer," she said. "It hasn't changed." The room had gone quiet. Not all at once. In pieces. A conversation died here. A card game stopped there. Men sensed it coming the way animals sense a storm. Bull smiled. He had a way of smiling that never reached his eyes. "Now that's a shame," he said. "Mr. Crane was hoping you'd be reasonable. A woman in your state. No husband. No money. Out here all alone." He leaned in close enough that she could smell the whiskey. "Bad things happen to women all alone." "Step back," Clara said. "Sign the paper, and they don't have to." Step back. And that was when he hit her. It wasn't a slap a man gives in anger. It was worse than that. It was a slap a man gives because he knows no one will stop him. He swung with the back of his hand, full force, and it caught Clara across the cheek and spun her sideways. She caught the edge of the table. She went down on one knee. One arm flew up to shield her head. The other wrapped around her belly, around her child. The crack of it echoed off the walls. And then, nothing. 40 men. And not one of them moved. The ranchers stared into their drinks. The barman found something to wipe. The card players studied their hands. Every man in that room did the math, and every man came up with the same answer. Crane owned them. And nobody crosses Crane for a widow who'd be gone by spring anyway. Bull Hagen stood over her, breathing hard, grinning down. He raised his hand again, and a chair scraped back in the far corner. It wasn't loud. That was the strange thing. In all that silence, it was just a chair, sliding slow across the floorboards. But every head turned toward it. The stranger stood up. He didn't hurry. He set his coffee cup down on the table, careful, like it was the most important thing in the room. Then he straightened to his full height, and for the first time, men got a proper look at him. He was big. Not loud big, not for show big. He was the kind of big that fills a doorway and makes you do the arithmetic on whether you really want to find out. Broad through the shoulders, thick through the neck. He stood a full head over Bull Hagen, and Bull was no small man. He wore a long coat gone gray with trail dust, and underneath it, riding low on his hip, was a gun belt that looked older than most of the men in the room. He crossed the floor slow, every boot fall loud in the quiet. He stopped 6 feet from Bull Hagen and said the first words anybody in Dry Creek had heard him speak. "Help her up." His voice was low, rough, like it hadn't been used much lately, but it carried to every corner of that room. Bull Hagen laughed. He looked the stranger up and down, and he made the second worst decision of his life. "And who in the hell," he said, "are you?" The stranger didn't answer the question. "Help her up," he said again, "and walk out that door. You do that, you keep your teeth." What happened next happened fast. Bull Hagen went for him. He was a big man too, and drunk men don't feel fear the way sober ones do. He swung a fist the size of a ham straight at the stranger's jaw. The stranger caught it. Just caught it, out of the air, like a man catching a tossed apple. And the look on Bull Hagen's face in that moment was something the whole room would talk about for years. Confusion, then pain. Because the stranger's hand closed around that fist and squeezed, and something in Bull's fingers made a sound that fists are not supposed to make. Then the stranger hit him. Once. Just once. A short, brutal punch up under the ribs, and all the air and all the whiskey and all the courage went out of Bull Hagen at the same time. He folded. He hit the floor. And he stayed there, curled up, wheezing, all 6.5 feet of Crane's enforcer reduced to a heap of groaning man on the saloon floor. The room did not make a sound. The stranger stepped over him like he was stepping over a log. He walked to Clara, and he crouched down beside her, slow, so as not to frighten her. And the same hand that had just broken a man's fist reached out, gentle as anything, and helped her to her feet. "You hurt?" he asked. Quiet. Just for her. Clara shook her head. She couldn't find her voice. The child, that undid something in her. That he asked about the child. She managed a small nod. "Good," he said. He guided her to a chair near the corner, away from the crowd, and he set her down easy. He poured her a glass of water from his own table and put it in her hands. And for the first time in 6 months, in a room full of men who'd looked away, somebody stood between Clara Bennett and the world. She looked at him properly then, for the first time. Up close he was older than she'd thought, maybe 40, with gray coming in at his temples and a long pale scar that ran from his ear down under his collar. His eyes were the tired kind, the kind that had seen too much and stopped expecting the world to be kind about any of it. But when they settled on her, they were gentle. Bull Hagen dragged himself up off the floor. He stumbled to the door, cradling his hand, and he turned at the threshold with hate in his eyes. But he didn't say anything. He just left, and the room let out its breath. Slowly, the noise came back. The cards. The talk. Somebody even laughed, nervous. It was over. The drunk was gone. The stranger sat down beside the widow, and the night went on, and Clara felt her heart finally start to slow. She thought it was over. She had no idea it had only just begun. The door banged open. It wasn't Bull Hagen. Bull Hagen was nothing. The man who walked in now wore a clean black coat and a silver watch chain, and he didn't sway, and he didn't shout. He didn't have to. The room went quiet the moment his boots hit the floor, and this time it wasn't fear of a fist. It was fear of the man who owned them all. Silas Crane had come to the saloon himself. Now, before I tell you what Crane said, let me say this. If you've ever known what it feels like to be the only one standing when everybody else sits down, if you've ever watched good people look away, then you already understand what this story is really about. And if you want to see how it ends, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because what Crane did next is the reason I wanted to tell you this story in the first place. Crane looked at Bull Hagen's blood on the floorboards. He looked at the stranger sitting beside the widow, and he smiled, the way a man smiles when he's already decided how a thing is going to go. "You're new," Crane said to the stranger. "So you don't know how things work around here. I'll forgive that. Once." He pulled off his gloves, finger by finger. "That man you put on the floor works for me. This town works for me. That woman beside you owes me money, and she's sitting on land that's going to be mine by the end of the month, one way or the other." He let that hang. "Now, you can ride out tonight, and we'll all forget this. Or you can stay and find out what happens to men who get between me and what's mine." The stranger didn't move. He didn't reach for his gun. He just looked at Crane, long and steady, and when he spoke, his voice was almost tired. "I've buried men like you," he said, "all across this country. I've got no more room in me for it. I came out here to be done with all that." He nodded toward Clara. "But you put your hand on her, or you send another man to, and I'll find that room. You understand me." It was the most anyone had heard him say. Crane's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. He'd heard that flatness in a man's voice before, and he knew what it meant. This wasn't a drifter talking tough. This was a man telling the truth. So Crane changed tactics. Men like Crane always do. "Suit yourself," he said. He pulled his gloves back on. "Stay? Play the hero." He turned to leave, then stopped, and looked back at Clara with those cold eyes. 11 days, he said. "Your note comes due in 11 days, Mrs. Bennett. $40, or the land is forfeit. Lawful and clean. No hands required." He tipped his hat. "Sleep well." And he walked out. Clara's hands were shaking again, but not from the slap this time. $40. She didn't have 40 cents. Crane hadn't needed to raise a hand at all. He'd just reminded her that the law itself was a weapon, and he owned that too. "He'll do it," she whispered. "He'll take everything." and there's nothing anyone can do about it. It's legal. The stranger was quiet a long moment. What's your name? She asked him. You stood up for me. The least I can know is your name. Eli, he said. Eli Ward. You shouldn't have done it, Eli Ward. You've made an enemy of the worst man in this county. Over a woman you don't even know. And Eli Ward looked at her, and at the belly she was holding, and something crossed his face that she couldn't read. Grief, maybe. Or memory. I had a wife once, he said. And a child coming. He didn't finish it. He didn't have to. I wasn't there when it mattered. He stood and pulled his coat straight. I don't aim to make that mistake twice. He told her the rest of it later, in pieces, over those 11 days. How he'd ridden with hard men in a hard war, and then for hire after, when the war ended and killing was the only trade he knew. How he'd come home one spring to a cabin gone cold, a fever that had taken his young wife and the child she'd been carrying, while he was 300 miles away earning blood money for a man not unlike Silas Crane. How he'd hung up his gun that day and ridden west with no plan but to outrun what he'd done. He hadn't meant to stop in Dry Creek. He'd only meant to water his horse. And then he'd seen a pregnant woman carrying plates in a room full of men who treated her like dirt, and something he thought was long dead in him had stirred. The next 11 days, Eli Ward did not leave. He took a room across from Clara's. He fixed the fence on the Bennett land that had fallen since Thomas died. He chopped wood. He fixed the saloon door he'd nearly torn off its hinges. And every night he sat in that corner with his coffee, watching the door. And slowly, quietly, the town began to watch him back. Because here's what happens when one man stands up. It reminds the others that they can. But Crane didn't sit still. For days in, Clara showed up for work and found the saloon door locked against her. Crane owned the building, and Crane had told the barman that if Clara Bennett set foot inside again, the barman would be looking for a new town to pour drinks in. So just like that, the little work she had was gone. Then she went to the general store for flour and salt, and the shopkeeper wouldn't meet her eyes. Her credit was cut. Crane's word again. He was squeezing her slow, the way you drain a wound, making sure that even if she found the $40, she'd have nothing left to live on after. Making sure she'd give up and leave on her own. It was almost worse than the fist. The fist, at least, you could see coming. That was the night Eli Ward did a thing that surprised her. He showed up at her door with a sack of flour, a side of bacon, and a tin of coffee, paid for out of his own pocket from a town 2 days' ride over, where Crane's word didn't reach. He didn't make a speech about it. He just set it on her table and started splitting kindling for her stove like it was the most natural thing in the world. Clara stood in the doorway and watched this enormous, silent man crouched at her hearth, and for the first time since Thomas died, she let herself cry. Not from grief. From the simple, forgotten shock of someone taking care of her. Eli didn't say anything about that either. He just built the fire up warm, set the coffee on to boil, and let her be. And the town kept shifting. It started small. The barman began slipping Clara extra bread out the back door. The blacksmith fixed her wagon wheel and wouldn't take a cent. An old rancher named Pell, who'd looked away the night of the slap, came up to Eli one morning, hat in his hands, and said he was ashamed of himself, and what could he do? It wasn't much. A few dollars here. A loyalty there. But Crane felt it. Crane felt the town shifting under his boots, and men like Crane cannot allow that. So on the 10th night, one day before the note came due, Silas Crane stopped waiting for the law to do his work. They came after midnight. 6 men on horseback, torches in their hands, riding hard for the Bennett land. Crane meant to burn the house, burn the barn, burn every reason Clara had to stay, and make it look like the kind of accident that happens to women who live alone. But Eli Ward had been a soldier, and soldiers don't sleep the night before. He was waiting on the porch when they rode in. The first rider never saw the rope strung between the posts. His horse hit it, and he went down hard in the dirt. The torch rolled from his hand and guttered out in the mud. The second man, Eli, took off his saddle with the stock of a rifle before he'd even reined in. And then the night came apart into shouting and dust and the wild whinny of frightened horses. Eli moved through it the way he'd been trained to a long time ago, in a war he'd spent 6 years trying to forget. He didn't shoot to kill. That was the thing Clara would remember after. Even then, even with 6 men come to burn her alive, he fired to wound, to scatter, to break their nerve. A man's gun hand, a horse's flank, the dirt at their feet. A bullet caught him high on the left shoulder and spun him half around. He felt the warm spread of it under his coat. But he'd been shot before, and he knew the kind that killed you from the kind that only hurt, and this was the kind that only hurt. He stayed on his feet. He kept moving. But Crane's men had come to do murder, and one of them got past him, kicked through the front door, into the house, looking for Clara. And that was when Clara Bennett's water broke. She was on the floor of the back room, gripped by a pain that had nothing to do with fear, her whole body bending around the child that had picked this exact night to come. The man loomed over her in the dark, gun in his hand, and he raised it. He never fired. Eli Ward came through that doorway like the wrath of God himself. There was no gun in his hand now. He'd run dry, or run out of patience, and it didn't matter which. He took the man by the collar and the belt and threw him bodily through the window, glass and all, out into the night. Then he dropped to his knees beside Clara, blood soaking through his own sleeve, and the man who'd faced down 6 killers without blinking suddenly looked terrified. "Tell me what to do," he said. "Clara, tell me what to do." Outside, the surviving riders were already running. 2 of their number were down. The house hadn't burned. The widow hadn't broken. And worst of all, word was already spreading, because the blacksmith and Old Pell and a dozen others had seen the torches against the night sky and come running with rifles of their own. The town had finally come, just not for Crane. By the time the sun came up over Dry Creek, Silas Crane's men were gone, scattered or in the dirt. And in the back room of a homestead Crane had sworn to burn, a baby's first cry cut through the morning air. A girl, healthy and furious and alive. Eli Ward held that baby in 2 hands that had killed men, and he was shaking. Clara, spent and gray and alive, watched him through half-closed eyes and saw something on his face she'd never have believed a man like that could feel. Wonder. Plain, helpless wonder. The neighbors stood in the yard with their rifles lowered, and nobody said a word as the sound of a newborn's crying filled the house where a murder was supposed to happen. Silas Crane was not a man who'd been beaten before, and he did not take to it well. He came into town 3 days later with a paper in his hand and the county sheriff at his side, ready to take the Bennett land by law since fire had failed him. He'd paid that sheriff for years. He expected it to be simple. But Dry Creek was not the town it had been 11 days ago. When Crane stepped down off his horse, he found the street was full. The barman, the blacksmith, Old Pell, the shopkeeper, the livery man, the ranchers who'd spent years looking at their boots. They didn't say much. They didn't have to. They just stood there, the whole town, between Silas Crane and the widow's land. And standing out front, with that same long coat and one arm in a sling, was Eli Ward, holding Clara's baby girl in the crook of the other like she weighed nothing at all. The sheriff looked at that street full of people. He looked at the paper in Crane's hand, and he discovered, all at once, that he had no stomach for it. A man can be bought when nobody's watching. It's a different thing entirely when the whole town is. "I think," the sheriff said slowly, "this note's been paid." Old Pell stepped forward and dropped a roll of bills into the sheriff's hand. $40. Collected, dollar by dollar, from a town that had finally remembered how to stand. "Paid in full," Pell said. "You can write the receipt right here." Silas Crane looked at all of them, and for the first time, the man who owned Dry Creek understood that he didn't anymore. Whatever a man like Crane has, he has only because frightened people let him keep it. And these people weren't frightened. Not anymore. He got back on his horse. He didn't make a speech. Men like Crane never have anything to say once the fear is gone. He just rode out the way he'd come, and the town watched him go, and that was the end of his hold on Dry Creek. Now, let me tell you how it ended. The real ending. Not Crane. Crane was never the point. A year later, if you'd ridden through Dry Creek, you'd have found the Bennett land green and worked and alive. You'd have found a fence mended straight and true, and a barn rebuilt, and a man too big for the doorway ducking through it with a baby girl laughing on his shoulder. Eli Ward never did leave. It wasn't sudden, the way they came together. It was the slowest thing in the world. A man who'd sworn off his own past, and a woman who'd lost her future, learning day by day that they could lean on each other and the weight would hold. He never pushed. She never asked him to. It just happened, the way the strongest things do, quietly, over time, until one morning Clara realized she couldn't remember what the place had felt like before him. Clara named the girl Grace. But it was Eli who, late one night when the baby wouldn't settle, started calling her Gracie, low and rumbling, pacing the floor with her tiny against that broad chest until she finally slept. And the name stuck. Gracie, the first soft thing that hard man had let himself love in longer than he could say. They were married in the spring, under the cottonwood by the creek, the same tree Thomas had planted, with the whole town there. The little girl they raised as his own. He taught her to ride before she could properly walk. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, Clara would catch sight of his hands. Those huge, scarred, dangerous hands that had broken a man's fist and thrown another through a window. And she'd watch those same hands cradle their daughter, gentle as anything, careful as a man handling something holy. The night they met, a hand came down to strike her, and 40 men looked away. The rest of her life, those hands were the ones that kept the world from ever touching her again. And not once, not one single time, did Eli Ward ever raise his hand to her in anger. He'd buried that man, out there on a homestead in Dry Creek. And in his place, he'd found something he thought the war had taken from him for good. A family, worth standing up for.